Hi everyone, and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So this is the last video of chapter 9, and in the previous video we talked about how the brainstem is involved in movements, how the basal ganglia modulate movement through excitatory pathways and inhibitory pathways, specifically through the GPI or the globus pallidus internal part. And we talked about the involvement of the cerebellum in the fine-tuning and correcting or adjusting of movement. So in this video, we will talk about the motor pathways in the brain and in the spinal cord. So there are two main ones, the corticobulbar tract and the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract can then again divide into the lateral and into the ventral corticospinal tract. So we'll dive deeper into that one at a time. So how does our brain communicate with the spinal cord? The way we make movements is represented in the brain's motor cortex and also in other cortices that are necessary for movement. The neural circuit for executing these actions are represented in the spinal cord. So the spinal cord and the brain have to work together for our body to move. If there was no spinal cord, the brain alone would not do a lot, right? So the spinal cord will technically receive this information from the brain and then send it to our muscles. The neocortex sends major projections to the brainstem as the corticobulbar tracts, and the neocortex will send major projections to the spinal cord as the corticospinal tracts, which we also call pyramidal tracts. So it goes from the cortex to the spinal cord, hence the name corticospinal tract. So the corticobulbar tracts, they terminate in nuclei that control facial muscles and take part in controlling facial movements. So if you're frowning or smiling, you are using the corticobulbar tracts for your face to move. The corticospinal tract ends on interneurons and also on motor neurons in the spinal cord and controls limb and finger and toe and body movements. So axons that form the corticobulbar and corticospinal tract do not only descend from the primary motor cortex, but also from the somatosensory cortex and premotor areas. And these areas all work together for these full and complex movements. Okay, so a little recap. I know I threw a lot of terms at you. So the corticobulbar tract goes from the cortex to the brainstem, and it is important for facial muscles and also neck muscles. So it goes from all these areas of the cortex, motor cortex, and a little bit behind it, somatosensory cortex, and then it goes to the brainstem right here. So it mainly receives information from the more ventral side of the motor cortex, since the face is represented here, but also from other cortices in the brain. And then we have the corticospinal tracts, which we also call the pyramidal tracts, which go from cortex to spinal cord. And these are very important for sending all the information to the rest of our body, so to our muscles, so we can move and maintain our posture, etc. The corticospinal tract axons descend into the brainstem, and then they send collaterals to a few brainstem nuclei and eventually emerging on the brainstem's ventral surface. And here they form a large bump on each side of that surface. So these bumps are known as pyramids, and they're right here on this picture, or here they're called pyramidal protrusions. So the pyramids give the corticospinal tract their nickname, which is the pyramidal tracts. From this location, so when they hit the pyramids, about 95% of the motor axons descend from the left, cross over to, where's my mouse? So about 95% that will cross over to the right side of the brainstem. And the same thing happens from the right side of the cortex. So it will go down and then 95% will cross over. And then 5% will remain on the original side. So this division will create 2 corticospinal tracts per hemisphere, descending on each side of the spinal cord. So let's just focus on the left hemisphere for now, but keep in mind that you also have the same thing for the right hemisphere. So the fibers that cross over form the lateral corticospinal tract. They go way more to the outside, and they are the lateral corticospinal tract. And the one that remain on the original side form the ventral corticospinal tract, and they're way more ventral in the brainstem. So the lateral corticospinal tract will control the limbs and the fingers and the toes, and the fibers that don't cross over, that are the ventral corticospinal tracts, will control the midline of the body, or what we also say the trunk. So each hemisphere's motor cortex controls the limbs of the opposite side of the body and the trunk on the same side of the body. So keep that in mind. So each hemisphere's motor cortex controls the limbs, so the limbs and fingers on the opposite side, but the trunk and the midline on the same side. So if I asked you what hemisphere is necessary to control your right hand, you have to say your left hemisphere. So, little recap. So let's look at the left hemisphere only. It goes down to the brainstem. Whenever it hits the pyramids, 95% crosses over, and these will form the lateral corticospinal tract, and these will move the limbs and your fingers and toes, and 5% will stay on the original side and will be way more ventral right here, so they're called the ventral corticospinal tract, and they will move the muscles of the midline or your trunk. So the lateral corticospinal tract is decussated, so it moves over, and it controls the limbs and your digits, and this is 95% of your fibers, of the fibers of the original tracts. The ventral corticospinal tract, this is the one that stays ipsilateral, so it stays on the same side of the hemisphere, and it will move the midline of your body, and this is only 5% of the fibers. Okay, so all movements eventually depend on the spinal cord neurons that connect to our muscles. So limb muscles are always arranged in pairs. So one member is the extensor muscle, and this will move the limb away from the body. And the other member will be the flexor muscle, and this will move the limb towards the body. So connections between the spinal cord interneurons and motor neurons cause the muscle pairs to work in concert. So when one of them contracts, the other one has to relax. So in the spinal cord interneurons and motor neurons, they relay instructions from the brainstem through their connections and cooperatively organize the movements of many muscles. So here you can see a very schematic picture of an arm, and the extensor will move the limb away from the of the body, and the flexor will move the limb towards the body. So one will always need to be active and the other needs to be relaxed. So both extensor and flexor motor neurons project to the appropriate muscle. So here's kind of the same example as the previous one. So the tricep extends the lower arm away from the body, and the bicep will move the lower arm towards the body. So whenever one contracts, the other one has to relax, and also the other way around. So here the bicep is the flexor muscle and the tricep is the extensor muscle. And this was the end of this chapter, and I will see you guys back soon for the next chapter.